The summer of 1862 found the American Republic balanced on a knife's edge. For over a year, the Civil War had raged, a conflict whose scale and savagery had already shocked the world, yet whose ultimate outcome remained shrouded in the smoke of indecisive battles. In the Eastern Theater, all attention was fixed on the peninsula of Virginia, a swampy, humid finger of land between the York and James rivers. Here, a colossal Union army, over 100, Avrozoran strong and christened the Army of the Potomac, had crawled to within sight of the spires of Richmond, the Confederate capital. Its commander, Major General George B. McClellan, the brilliant, meticulous, and profoundly cautious young Napoleon, had engineered a masterful logistical campaign, moving his vast force by sea to the very gates of the rebellion. His telegraph wires hummed with demands for more men, more guns, more of everything, for he was perpetually convinced he was outnumbered by a shadowy, superior foe. In Richmond, a palpable terror had taken hold. The Confederate government packed its archives onto trains, preparing for flight. Civilians could hear the distant thunder of Union artillery. The end, it seemed to many, was a matter of days away. But within the besieged capital, a new and utterly different spirit was coalescing around a figure who had, until recently, been the military advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. General Robert E. Lee, a man of antique courtesy and iron resolve, had just taken field command of the forces defending Richmond, which he would soon rename the Army of Northern Virginia. Where McClellan saw overwhelming Confederate numbers, Lee saw strategic opportunity born of desperation. Where McClellan prized preparation and siegecraft, Lee believed in the annihilating power of the offensive, in audacity, and in the fighting quality of his men. The Confederate army, though smaller, numbering around 90, but with only about 65 immediately available for a strike, was concentrated, motivated by the defense of its heart, and now led by a general whose operational vision was as daring as McClellan's was deliberate. The stage was set not for a siege, but for a violent, sprawling, 7-act tragedy of errors, heroism, and transformative carnage that would become known as the 7 Days Battles. From June 25th to July 1st, 1862, these battles would not merely save Richmond, they would shatter the Union's short-term hope for victory, cement the legend of Robert E. Lee, introduce the nation to the cost of Napoleonic tactics in the age of the rifle musket, and irrevocably demonstrate that the war would be a long, bloody struggle of attrition. The geographical setting was a protagonist in itself. The peninsula was a tangled maze of slow rivers, thick woods, boggy swamps, and a few poor roads. McClellan's army was divided by the rain-swollen Chickahominy River, a sluggish, bog-fringed stream that became a formidable military obstacle after spring rains. The bulk of his force, 4 corps, sat south of the river, arrayed in a great arc facing the defensive works of Richmond. North of the Chickahominy, protecting his supply line, the Richmond and York River Railroad running back to his base at White House Landing on the York River, stood the isolated V Corps under Major General Fitz-John Porter. This disposition was McClellan's critical vulnerability. Lee, studying maps in his Richmond headquarters, saw it with crystal clarity. His plan was a classic military gambit: use a small force under the pugnacious Major General John B. Magruder to mask the vast Union army south of the Chickahominy with theatrical displays, marching columns in view, beating drums, feigning attacks, to convince McClellan the main Confederate army was still in his front. Meanwhile, Lee would mass the bulk of his force, led by his most aggressive subordinates, Major Generals Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, D.H. Hill, and A.P. Hill, and fall upon the isolated Porter north of the river, destroy Porter's corps, cut the Union supply line, and McClellan's mighty army south of the Chickahominy would be doomed, trapped between Lee's victorious legions and the defenses of Richmond. It was a brilliant plan, demanding precise coordination and relentless speed. Its success, however, would hinge on factors Lee could not fully control: the soggy terrain, the performance of his still untested army in complex maneuvers, and most of all, the enigmatic Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had just completed his spectacular whirlwind Shenandoah Valley campaign, marching his foot cavalry hundreds of miles and defeating several Union columns in detail. Lee summoned him to Richmond, expecting the relentless, swift-striking commander of legend. But the Jackson who arrived was exhausted, perhaps unwell, and about to enter a perplexing week-long lethargy that would mar the execution of Lee's designs from the very beginning. Day 1, June 25th, the skirmish at Oak Grove. McClellan, ever proactive in reconnaissance but cautious in battle, initiated the 7 days himself, seeking to advance his siege lines and secure ground for future artillery positions. He ordered a limited attack south of the Chickahominy near the settlement of Oak Grove, or King's Schoolhouse. It was a minor affair by the standards of what was to come, a brutal, day-long fight in dense, swampy woods where regiments stumbled into each other at point-blank range. The Union gained a few hundred yards of worthless swamp at a cost of about 600 casualties on each side. Its significance was psychological. For the Confederates, it confirmed that the Union Army was still active in their front, aiding Magruder's deception. For McClellan, it was a costly confirmation of his deepest fears. The enemy was strong and willing to fight fiercely for every inch. As reports filtered in, he became even more convinced he faced 200 Weissenbarren Confederates, a phantom army that existed only in his anxious mind. That evening, a more ominous report arrived. Confederate cavalry under the flamboyant J.E.B. Stuart had ridden a complete circuit around the Union Army, confirming the vulnerability of Porter's flank and supply line. The noose, though McClellan did not yet perceive its full shape, was being measured. Day 2, June 26th, the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, Mechanicsville. Lee's grand offensive began in earnest. The plan called for Jackson's command, marching from the north to turn Porter's right flank at Mechanicsville, while the divisions of A.P. Hill, Longstreet, and D.H. Hill crossed the Chickahominy and assaulted the Union front. But from the dawn, the plan unraveled. Jackson, uncharacteristically slow, did not appear. His men, after forced marches, were resting, and Jackson himself seemed disconnected, failing to send crucial couriers to Lee. Impatient and fearing the element of surprise was lost, A.P. Hill launched a premature frontal assault across the Chickahominy at Mechanicsville in mid-afternoon. What followed was a slaughter. Fitz-John Porter had chosen a superb defensive position behind Beaver Dam Creek. The stream was steep-banked and swampy, crossed by only a few bridges. Union artillery, over 30 guns, was massed on the high ground beyond, and infantry dug in along the banks. The Confederate attacks, brave but disjointed, were mown down in waves. Brigade after brigade advanced across open fields, through the boggy creek, and up the slopes into a tempest of rifle and cannon fire. D.H. Hill, watching the carnage, later wrote, "It was not war, but murder." Jackson finally arrived on the field near dusk, but too late to influence the action. He did nothing, camping his army while the battle raged within earshot, his inscrutable behavior baffling his subordinates and Lee alike. The day ended in a clear Union tactical victory. Porter's corps lost about 350 men. The Confederates suffered over 500 casualties. Yet, it was a strategic Confederate gain. The ferocity of the assault and the presence of Jackson on his flank convinced Porter, and more importantly, McClellan, that the position was untenable. That night, under orders from McClellan, Porter abandoned his strong lines and fell back several miles southeast to an even more formidable position near a place called Gaines's Mill. Lee's offensive had stuttered badly, bloodied at its first contact. But it had achieved its first objective, prying the Union grip from the Richmond and York River Railroad. The Union supply line was severed. The gears of the campaign had shifted. McClellan, his fears confirmed by the day's heavy fighting, made a momentous decision. He would abandon his base on the York River and shift his entire army, its enormous supply train, and its siege artillery to a new base on the James River, under the protection of the Union Navy's gunboats. It was a vast, risky logistical undertaking, a change of base that was, in essence, a fighting retreat. The campaign to capture Richmond was over. The struggle to save the Army of the Potomac had begun. Day 3, June 27th, the Battle of Gaines's Mill. This was the pivotal day, the largest and bloodiest battle of the 7 days, and the only clear-cut Confederate tactical victory. Porter, having withdrawn, established a magnificent defensive line on a plateau behind Boatswain's Swamp, near the mill of Dr. William Gaines. The position was a concave curve, with both flanks anchored on the Chickahominy, and the center fortified with felled trees and entrenched infantry. Over 100 Union cannon crowned the heights. It was a natural fortress. Lee, determined to crush Porter before McClellan could fully extricate his army, planned another complex converging attack. Again, Jackson was to lead the main flanking movement from the north, while A.P. Hill, Longstreet, and now the command of Major General John B. Hood, made frontal and flank assaults. And again, the coordination failed. Jackson marched slowly, getting entangled in unfamiliar roads and hesitant in the face of minor Union resistance. For hours, A.P. Hill's division alone bore the brunt of the fighting, launching repeated, desperate charges against the Union center. The fighting was some of the most intense of the war. Union infantry, packed in dense lines, fired volley after volley into the advancing grey lines. Confederate brigades were torn apart, their colours falling and rising again as colour-bearers were shot down. The air grew thick with smoke and the deafening roar of musketry and artillery. Hill's division was being bled white, and by late afternoon, the Union line, though strained, held. As the sun began to sink, the battle reached its climax. Lee, a picture of calm intensity on horseback, had assembled every available brigade for a final all-or-nothing assault. At around 7 p.m., Longstreet and Hill launched renewed attacks on the Union left and center. Simultaneously, Jackson's freshest troops, including the Texas Brigade of John Bell Hood, finally crashed into the Union right. Hood, a fierce fighter, famously told his men, "Forward, guide on the enemy's fire." In a furious, chaotic melee across the swamp and up the plateau, the Confederate tide finally broke through. A breach was made, then widened. Union regiments, out of ammunition and overwhelmed by the pressure from multiple directions, began to give way. A stubborn, heroic rearguard action, including a famous charge by the 5th U.S. Cavalry, prevented a rout, but the line was irrevocably broken. As darkness fell, Porter's shattered corps retreated across the Chickahominy, burning the bridges behind them. Gaines's Mill was a Confederate victory, but a ghastly one. Lee lost nearly 900 men killed and wounded. Union losses were about 600-800. Porter's corps was mauled but not destroyed. Most critically, the victory unlocked the next phase of the campaign. With Porter driven back, the path was clear for Lee to threaten the rear of McClellan's main army south of the Chickahominy. But the day also revealed profound truths. It showed the sheer defensive power of entrenched infantry with rifled muskets, a lesson that would define the rest of the war. It demonstrated the lethal inadequacy of Napoleonic frontal assaults against prepared positions. And it cemented the command personalities: Lee's relentless aggression, Jackson's baffling failure, and the emergence of fighters like Longstreet and Hood. Day 4, June 28th, the quiet day. A surreal calm descended on the battlefield. The guns fell silent. McClellan used this day to commit fully to his retreat, or change of base, toward the James River. It was a day of frenetic activity behind Union lines, as miles of wagons, artillery caissons, and herds of cattle began the slow, treacherous movement south and east across the peninsula. The army's mood shifted from confident aggression to somber determination. McClellan, believing himself betrayed by a Washington government that had failed to support him, sent a famous telegram to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. I have lost this battle because my force was too small. The government must not and cannot hold me responsible for the result. He blamed everyone but himself, yet his operational skill now shone in the meticulous planning of a retreat under extreme pressure. He established a strong defensive line at Malvern Hill, near the James, and began pulling his corps back in stages. Lee, for his part, was perplexed. Where was McClellan going? His cavalry reconnaissance was poor. He initially believed the Union Army might be retreating back down the peninsula toward its old base. It wasn't until late in the day that he grasped McClellan's intention to reach the James. Lee devised a new plan: to intercept and destroy the Union Army in motion. He ordered Magruder to press the Union rearguard south of the Chickahominy, while the bulk of his army, now reunited south of the river, would pursue and strike the Union flank during its vulnerable march. Day 5, June 29th, the battles of Garnett's and Golding's Farms and Savage's Station. The pursuit began in earnest, but again was hampered by confusion and poor coordination. South of the Chickahominy, Magruder, a master of deception but nervous in independent command, advanced cautiously against the Union rear guard, comprised of the corps of Edwin Sumner and Samuel Heintzelman. Two minor engagements at Garnett's and Golding's Farms were indecisive skirmishes. The main action occurred at Savage's Station, a key stop on the Richmond and York River Railroad, now piled high with Union supplies that were put to the torch. Here, Magruder launched piecemeal attacks against strong Union positions. The fighting was fierce but disjointed. A notable event was the first major use of a railroad locomotive as a weapon of war. The Union Armored Railroad Battery, a flat car mounting a heavy naval gun, shelled Confederate positions before being abandoned and destroyed. Despite having a numerical advantage, Magruder failed to land a decisive blow. The Union rearguard, fighting with discipline, held long enough for the vast wagon train to continue its crawl toward the James. That night, under cover of darkness and a tremendous thunderstorm, they destroyed the last bridge over the White Oak Swamp and continued the retreat. Lee's hope of catching the Union Army strung out on the road was fading. The window for a knockout punch was narrowing. Day 6, June 30th, the Battle of Glendale, Fraser's Farm. This was Lee's best and last chance to cut the Union Army in half. McClellan's retreat had created a sprawling, vulnerable column. The heart of his army was passing through a critical crossroads at Glendale, where the Charles City Road, the Willis Church Road, and the Long Bridge Road converged. If Confederate forces could seize this junction, they would split the Union Army, isolating its rear from the safety of Malvern Hill and the James River. Lee devised his most complex plan yet: a coordinated hammer and anvil assault from 4 directions. Longstreet and A.P. Hill were to deliver the main blow at Glendale. Stonewall Jackson, after crossing White Oak Swamp, was to push into the Union rear from the north. The divisions of Benjamin Huger and Theophilus Holmes were to attack from the west and southwest. It was a visionary plan for total encirclement. And it failed utterly, victim once more to the fog of war, difficult terrain, and command failure. Jackson, at White Oak Swamp, encountered a destroyed bridge and a determined Union artillery defense on the far side. Rather than seek a ford or use his engineering prowess, he bizarrely sat idle all afternoon, reportedly napping under a tree, while the sound of battle raged just a few miles away. Huger's advance was stalled by felled trees across the road, which he treated as a major obstacle, inching forward with artillery rather than pushing his infantry through the woods. Holmes made a feeble demonstration that was easily repulsed by Union gunboats on the James. Thus, the full weight of the battle fell upon Longstreet and A.P. Hill at Glendale. What followed was some of the most desperate, close-quarter fighting of the war. In tangled woods and across farm fields, brigades collided in a series of brutal, often confused engagements. There was no continuous line, just a bloody scrum of regiments fighting for isolated clearings and woodlots. Commanders on both sides fed units into the fray piecemeal. At one point, Union General George McCook was captured by Confederates, then recaptured by his own men minutes later. The fighting surged back and forth around the vital crossroads. At dusk, after hours of horrific combat, the Union line, though bent and bloodied, still held the junction. The rear guard had bought another crucial day. That night, the last Union units disengaged and continued their retreat to the final formidable defensive position Lee had not yet tested, Malvern Hill. Day 7, July 1st. The Battle of Malvern Hill. The Army of the Potomac, tired but intact, now occupied what was arguably the strongest defensive position of the entire war. Malvern Hill was not a hill, but a vast, open plateau, a natural amphitheatre of death. Its slopes were clear of major obstructions, providing perfect fields of fire. Over 250 Union cannon, a staggering array of field artillery and heavy siege guns were massed tier upon tier on the crest and along the slopes. The infantry, multiple corps deep, supported the artillery and protected the flanks, which were anchored on swamps and protected by gunboats on the James River. It was an artillerist's dream and an infantryman's nightmare. Lee, flushed with the aggressive momentum of the week and perhaps underestimating the position due to poor reconnaissance, believed the Union Army was demoralized and ripe for a final blow. He rejected Longstreet's counsel for a flanking movement. Instead, he planned a massive artillery bombardment to soften the Union line, followed by a coordinated infantry assault. The plan was sound in theory but disastrous in execution. The Confederate artillery, outgunned and outranged, failed miserably. Dispersed across broken ground, their fire was inaccurate and ineffective, and they were quickly silenced by the concentrated, crushing fire of the Union Grand Battery. The intended preparatory barrage never materialized. Yet due to confused orders and a miscommunicated signal, the supposed advance of a single brigade being misinterpreted as the order for a general assault, the Confederate infantry attack degenerated into a series of horrific piecemeal charges. What followed was, in the words of a Union officer, a scene of war such as I had never witnessed before. Brigade after Confederate brigade emerged from the woods at the base of the hill and advanced across open, rising ground. They were met by a cataclysm of steel, solid shot, shell, spherical case, shrapnel, and canister tore enormous gaps in their ranks. Canister, essentially giant shotgun blasts from the cannon's muzzle, mowed down entire companies at close range. The Union infantry, largely spectators to the artillery's work, added sheets of rifle fire. The charges, though brave to the point of insanity, had no chance. Some brigades got within a few hundred yards of the crest, only to be annihilated or driven back in tatters. The fields became a slaughter pen, littered with the dead and wounded. D.H. Hill later wrote, "It was not war, it was murder." As dusk turned to night and a torrential rain began to fall, soaking the bloody ground, the final Confederate attacks sputtered out. The Army of Northern Virginia had been brutally repulsed, suffering over 500 casualties against Union losses of about 3,000. That night, under the cover of a providential storm and immense exhaustion on both sides, McClellan completed his retreat to Harrison's Landing on the James River, a secure, gunboat-protected enclave. The 7 days were over. Aftermath and legacy. In purely military terms, the 7 days' battles were a colossal, bloody draw. Lee had failed in his strategic objective of destroying the Army of the Potomac. McClellan had failed in his campaign to take Richmond. Yet, the campaign's consequences were profound and asymmetrical. For the Confederacy, it was an immense strategic and psychological victory. Richmond was saved. The imminent threat of collapse was lifted. Robert E. Lee emerged as a national hero, the savior of the capital. His aggressive, offensive-minded leadership invigorated the South and cemented his command. The Army of Northern Virginia had been forged in fire, its confidence soaring despite the ghastly cost. However, that cost could not be ignored. Confederate casualties totaled approximately 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing, nearly a quarter of Lee's engaged force. These were losses the manpower-starved South could ill afford to repeat. The battles also exposed critical weaknesses: poor staff work, unreliable subordinate coordination, most glaringly with Jackson, and a dangerous reliance on complex, poorly communicated attack plans. For the Union, it was a crushing strategic and psychological defeat. A campaign that had promised to end the war with the capture of the rebel capital had instead ended in a humiliating retreat. Northern morale, high after victories in the West, plummeted. McClellan's star faded, though he retained the loyalty of his soldiers. The Army of the Potomac, though it had fought well defensively, lost about 16,000 men and was shaken in confidence. Politically, the failure hardened the resolve of radical Republicans in Congress and began to shift Abraham Lincoln's thinking toward more revolutionary war aims, including emancipation, as a necessary means to weaken the Confederacy fundamentally. Tactically, the 7 days were a watershed. They were a brutal tutorial in the new reality of warfare. The defensive power of entrenched infantry armed with rifled muskets, coupled with massed artillery, was decisively demonstrated at Beaver Dam Creek, Gaines's Mill, and, most spectacularly, at Malvern Hill. The romantic, Napoleonic ideal of the decisive bayonet charge against enemy lines was shown to be obsolete and horrifically costly. Future battles would see an increasing emphasis on fieldworks, digging, and the search for flanking movements rather than direct assaults. The nature of command was also highlighted. The need for clear communication, reliable intelligence, and staff coordination became painfully obvious. The 7 days marked the true beginning of the war of attrition in the East. Lee had learned he could beat the Union Army, but not easily annihilate it. The Union learned that defeating Lee would require not just numbers, but grim perseverance and a willingness to accept casualties on a scale previously unimagined. The battles elevated Robert E. Lee to the pantheon of military commanders and set the stage for the even greater bloodlettings of 2nd Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. They ended the Peninsula Campaign and initiated a new, darker phase of the war. In the end, the 7 days were less about the fate of Richmond in the summer of 1862 and more about the fate of America itself. They proved the rebellion would not be crushed in one grand campaign. They signaled that the conflict would be long, brutal, and transformative. The ground between the Chickahominy and the James was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible where the old notions of war were burned away, revealing the harsh, industrialized face of modern conflict that would define the remainder of the American Civil War and foreshadow the horrors of the century to come. The hope for a short, decisive war died in those 7 days, replaced by the grim understanding that only through relentless total pressure could the Union be preserved.